sound of dishes clinking in the sink, mixed with the low hum of voices coming from the living room. The house smelled of expensive perfume and roasted meat, the kind of scent that told anyone who walked in that people with money lived there. In the kitchen stood a young maid, quietly scrubbing plates while listening to laughter echo through the halls. Her hands moved automatically, years of habit guiding her every motion. She wasn't really listening to the jokes or the stories being told out there, but she could feel the mood, carefree, loud, and full of people who had no idea what it meant to struggle. She had been working for this family for almost a year. They weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They treated her like a shadow, someone who existed only to serve, invisible unless needed. She was used to it. It was the same way in every house she had cleaned since she was 16. That night, the family was hosting a party. The living room was full of well-dressed guests, men in suits and women in glittering dresses. A piano sat in the corner of the room, polished until it reflected the chandelier above. It was more decoration than instrument. No one in the family actually played. It was there because it made the house look cultured. The maid walked out quietly, carrying a tray of drinks. She moved carefully, avoiding eye contact, hoping not to spill anything. As she placed a glass on the table, one of the guests, a young man with a smug smile, pointed at her. "Hey," he said, laughing. "She looks like she could play that piano." The others chuckled. The maid froze, unsure how to respond. She felt her face heat up, but she didn't look at them. Another guest joined in, saying, "Yeah, let's see what she can do. Come on, play something for us." The laughter grew louder. It wasn't the kind of laughter that welcomed you in. It was the kind that made you small. The host, sitting in his armchair, smirked and waved his hand. "Go ahead, give us a show," he said, clearly enjoying the attention. The maid's throat tightened. She wanted to disappear. I don't really play anymore," she said softly, her voice barely audible. The young man leaned back, grinning. "Come on, don't be shy. How hard can it be? Just hit a few keys." Everyone laughed again. Some guests even clapped mockingly. She could feel their eyes on her, amused, expectant, waiting for her to embarrass herself. She stood there for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as she held the tray. She wanted to refuse, but she also knew what would happen if she did. Refusal could be seen as disrespect, and disrespect could mean trouble, so she nodded quietly and placed the tray down on the side table. Her steps toward the piano felt heavy. The sound of her shoes on the marble floor echoed in the quiet room. The laughter faded a little as everyone leaned forward, waiting. She sat down on the bench, her reflection visible in the shiny black surface of the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys. It had been years since she last touched a piano. Back then she was a different person, full of dreams and laughter, living in a small house where music filled the evenings. Her mother used to play, and she would sit beside her, learning by watching, mimicking her every movement. That piano was old and missing keys, but it was full of life. Those memories had faded slowly after her mother's passing, replaced by work, exhaustion, and silence. The voices behind her brought her back to the present. "Go on, let's hear it," someone said with a snicker. She took a deep breath. The room fell quiet. Her hands rested on the keys, and for a moment she didn't move. The air felt thick with expectation and ridicule. Then, almost without thinking, her fingers pressed down gently. The first notes came out soft and shaky, but as soon as she heard them, something inside her shifted. Her breathing steadied, her shoulders relaxed, and her hands began to move more freely. The music started to flow, not from memory, but from somewhere deep in her soul. The melody was slow, sad, but full of warmth. The guests, who had been waiting to laugh, went silent. The notes filled the room like a story being told without words. It wasn't a song anyone recognized, but it had feeling. So much feeling that it made even the proudest guest stop and listen. Her eyes stayed closed as she played. She wasn't in that living room anymore. She was back in her childhood home where her mother smiled softly and tapped her foot along to the rhythm. She could almost hear her mother's voice telling her to let the music speak. When she finally stopped, the silence in the room was heavy. The guests didn't clap right away. They just stared at her, unsure what to say. The same people who had mocked her minutes ago now looked like they had seen something they didn't understand. Finally, one person whispered, "That was beautiful." The maid lowered her hand slowly and stood up. She didn't look at anyone, just gave a small nod and turned to walk back toward the kitchen. Her heart was pounding, not from fear but from something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. In the kitchen, she leaned against the counter, her hands still trembling. She didn't know why she had played that song. She hadn't planned to. It had just come out of her, like it had been waiting all those years to be heard again. Out in the living room the morning after the party, the house looked quiet and calm again. The laughter and music from the night before were gone, replaced by the sound of birds outside and the soft clatter of dishes in the kitchen. The maid worked quietly, trying not to think about what had happened. But no matter how hard she tried, the memory of that piano kept coming back. She could still feel the smooth keys under her fingertips, the vibration of the sound inside her chest. It had felt like she was breathing again after years of holding her breath. But now she wondered if it had been a mistake. Maybe the guests had laughed after she left. Maybe the family thought she had overstepped her place. As she wiped the counters, she heard footsteps. The host's wife entered, still wearing her robe and holding a cup of coffee. She looked half awake, her hair tied up loosely. She didn't say good morning, she never did, but she hesitated near the kitchen door. "You played last night?" she said suddenly, her voice quiet. The maid turned, unsure how to respond. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. The woman nodded, still looking at her. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The maid hesitated. "My mother taught me when I was young," she said. The woman looked surprised. "Really, it sounded professional." There was a pause. The woman seemed to want to say more, but didn't. She took another sip of coffee, then turned and walked away. When the maid was alone again, she exhaled slowly. At least she wasn't in trouble. That was all she could ask for. Later that day, as she was dusting the living room, she noticed something unusual. The piano lid was open. It was never open unless she had left it that way, but she knew she hadn't touched it since the night of the party. On the stand sat a sheet of music, something she had never seen before. She leaned closer. It wasn't new. The edges were worn and the paper had faint pencil marks on it. It looked like it had been used by someone who actually played. She wondered who had left it there. The family didn't play. She was sure of that. Just then she heard the front door open. She quickly stepped back and continued dusting. Voices came from the hallway. One of them was the host's and the other belonged to a man she didn't recognize. They entered the living room. The guest was tall, with gray hair and kind eyes behind a pair of glasses. He carried a small folder under his arm. "This is her," the host said with a slight grin. "The one I told you about?" The maid looked up, startled. "Sir?" The older man smiled warmly. "You played last night, didn't you?" She hesitated. "Yes, sir. I was there," he said. "You played beautifully." She felt her cheeks grow warm. "Thank you," she murmured, unsure what else to say. The man looked at the piano. "Would you mind playing again?" "Just for a moment?" She froze. Her heart began to race. The memory of being laughed at flashed through her mind. I don't know if I should," she said softly. The host chuckled. "Go ahead. He's a music teacher. He won't bite." The maid's eyes widened slightly. A music teacher. That explained the folder. She took a deep breath and slowly walked toward the piano. Her hands trembled as she sat down. She didn't know what to play. She hadn't practiced in years, and the sheet on the stand wasn't something she recognized. Still, she let her fingers rest on the keys, closed her eyes, and began to play. The same melody from the night before filled the room, soft and haunting. The man listened closely, not moving, his face thoughtful. The notes rose and fell like waves, carrying something that words couldn't express. When she finished, the room fell silent. The man nodded slowly, his expression serious. "You have real talent," he said. "Not just skill, emotion. That's something you can't teach." The maid didn't know what to say. No one had ever said something like that to her before. He looked at the host. "Do you mind if I speak to her for a moment?" The host shrugged. "Go ahead. I've got calls to make." When he left, the room felt lighter. The man turned to her. "My name is Mr. Turner," he said kindly. "I run a small music program at the community center downtown. We help students from all backgrounds learn and perform. Have you ever thought about playing again? Seriously, I mean?" She blinked, taken aback. "Oh, I don't think I could, sir," she said quickly. "I work full-time here." He nodded. "I understand. But talent like yours shouldn't be hidden. If you ever want to play again, I'd be happy to help. No pressure, of course." She hesitated, unsure what to say. "Thank you," she whispered. He soon. Tiled. "Do you have a piano at home?" She shook her head. No, sir. He thought for a moment, then opened his folder. Inside were several sheets of music. He handed her one. Keep this. It's a simple piece. You can practice anywhere, even if it's just on a table. Music doesn't need a perfect instrument, it only needs heart. She looked at the paper in her hands. Her chest felt tight. Thank you, she said again, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded and smiled before leaving. When he was gone, she sat there for a while, staring at the sheet. The notes seemed to call to her, each line reminding her of something she'd lost and might just find again. That night, after finishing her chores and walking home, she placed the music sheet carefully on her table. The small apartment was quiet, except for the faint sound of the city outside. She ran her fingers over the notes, tracing each one as if it were a secret message. She didn't have a piano, but she began tapping the rhythm lightly on the table with her fingertips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to feel the melody come alive in her mind. Over the next few days, she found herself doing it again and again, at night before bed, in the morning before work, even during her lunch break. She would hum softly, letting the notes live in her heart. Then one afternoon, when she arrived at work, something unexpected happened. As she entered the living room to clean, she saw the host's wife standing by the piano. She turned when she heard the maid come in. You can use it, she said simply. The maid blinked in surprise. Ma'am? The piano, the woman said. You can practice here in the evenings after work. As long as you finish your duties, I don't mind. The nights grew quieter, but inside the grand house something new had begun. The maid's late-night piano sessions had become her secret joy, something she looked forward to every day. What had started as a moment of humiliation had turned into something healing, but now she wasn't the only one who listened. Every few nights the host's teenage daughter would sneak out of her room, barefoot and silent, to sit on the stairs and listen. She never interrupted, never spoke, just listened. There was something calming about the music, something that made her forget about all the noise of her daily life. One evening, when the maid finished playing, she heard a small voice behind her. You play beautifully, the girl said softly. The maid turned, startled, then smiled. You should be asleep, miss, the girl shrugged. I couldn't sleep. I wanted to hear you play again. The maid hesitated, then smiled kindly. Do you like the piano? The girl nodded. I always wanted to learn, but I don't think I'm any good. My mom says I don't have patience, the maid laughed softly. Patience comes with practice. Music is like breathing, you just have to feel it. The girl's eyes lit up. Can you teach me? The maid paused. She had never taught anyone before, and she wasn't sure if it was even allowed. I don't know if your parents would like that, she said gently. They don't have to know, the girl whispered, grinning. Just a few lessons, please. The maid hesitated again, then sighed with a small smile. All right, but only if you promise to practice. The girl nodded eagerly. From that night on, they met quietly after everyone went to bed. The maid would teach her how to sit, how to place her hands, and how to press the keys gently. The girl made mistakes at first, lots of them, but she never gave up. The maid encouraged her with patience and warmth, reminding her that music was about feeling, not perfection. Their lessons went on for weeks. Sometimes the maid played a melody and the girl watched in awe. Other times the girl tried to copy her, laughing whenever she hit the wrong note. The grand house, usually cold and stiff, began to feel alive again, filled with the quiet sound of music and laughter shared in secret. But one evening, their secret was discovered. The host's wife walked downstairs late at night to get a glass of water. As she passed the living room, she stopped when she heard the faint sound of the piano. Curious, she peeked inside. And there they were, the maid and her daughter sitting side by side at the piano bench. Her first instinct was shock. The maid wasn't supposed to be teaching her daughter anything. But then she saw the girl smile, the kind of genuine joy she hadn't seen on her face in months. She stayed silent, watching from the doorway as the maid patiently guided her daughter's hands. When the song ended, the girl laughed softly. Did I do it right? She asked. The maid smiled. Almost. You just have to let your hands relax. The woman stepped forward then, and both of them turned quickly. Mom! The girl gasped. The maid stood up immediately, her heart racing. I'm sorry, ma'am. She just wanted to learn. I didn't mean, but the woman raised a hand, her voice calm. It's all right. She looked at her daughter. You're learning to play? The girl nodded shyly. She's teaching me. Isn't she amazing? The woman's expression softened as she turned to the maid. You've been playing every night, haven't you? Yes, ma'am, the maid said quietly. Only after finishing my work. The woman was quiet for a moment, then nodded. You may continue teaching her, but from now on do it properly during the day, not in secret. The girl's face lit up. Really, Mom? Yes, the woman said with a small smile. But you both need rest. Go to bed now. The girl hugged her mother before running upstairs, full of excitement. The maid stood there, uncertain. Thank you, ma'am, she said softly. The woman smiled faintly. You have a gift. Don't hide it anymore. Then she turned and walked away. The next day, everything felt different. For the first time, the maid was allowed to sit at the piano in daylight, not hiding in the dark. The girl came down eagerly, ready for her first official lesson. The housekeeper even brought tea while they practiced. The maid taught her patiently, guiding her through simple melodies and rhythm exercises. The girl was bright and quick to learn. Sometimes she got frustrated when she made mistakes, but the maid would smile and say, "Every wrong note is just a step toward the right one." Their lessons became a daily routine. The girl started improving, and soon she could play short songs on her own. The host's wife would sometimes stop by to listen, and even the host himself would glance in, pretending not to care but staying long enough to hear the melody. One afternoon, as they finished a piece, the maid heard a familiar voice behind her. "That was lovely," said Mr. Turner, the music teacher. He had returned, invited by the family. The maid turned, surprised. "Mr. Turner?" she said with a smile. He smiled warmly. "I heard you've been teaching." "That's wonderful." The host's wife nodded proudly. "She's been amazing with my daughter. You should hear them together." Mr. Turner looked impressed. "I'm not surprised." Then he turned to the maid. "I'm organizing a small concert at the community center next month. It's for students and local performers. Would you be interested in playing?" The maid's eyes widened. "Oh, I don't think I could," but he interrupted gently. "You can. You're ready. You've been practicing, haven't you?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. He smiled. "Then it's settled. You'll perform one piece. I'll help you prepare." The family looked at her with genuine encouragement. For the first time in her life, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel in years: belonging. That night, she lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling. The idea of performing in front of people again scared her. But beneath the fear, there was excitement. She thought about her mother, how proud she would have been. Over the following weeks, Mr. Turner visited regularly to help her prepare. He brought new sheets of music, corrected her posture, and encouraged her every step of the way. The host's family allowed her to use their piano freely. Sometimes the girl sat nearby, cheering her on. The maid practiced for hours each evening, perfecting every note. The melody she chose was one that reminded her of her childhood. A song everyone at the party thought the night had already given them enough entertainment. The music was loud, laughter filled the room, and people danced in elegant clothes while holding glasses of sparkling drinks. But when someone shouted that the maid should play the piano, the energy shifted. It started as a cruel little joke, something meant to make the wealthy guests laugh. But what no one expected was how that moment would change the whole atmosphere of the evening and leave everyone in silence. The maid, Lila, stood there frozen. Her heart pounded so loudly that she could barely hear anything else. For a moment, she looked around, unsure if she'd really heard it right. The man who made the comment was smirking, clearly amused by his own idea. A few others chuckled along, thinking it would be harmless fun, but there was one person who didn't laugh. Mrs. Caldwell, the lady of the house. She turned to the man with a frown, though she didn't say anything. Lila's hands trembled as everyone turned their eyes toward her. She had never imagined being the center of attention in a room like this. She was there to serve, not to perform. Her uniform suddenly felt too tight and her legs too weak. For a second, she thought about refusing, but then she caught sight of the grand piano in the corner of the room. It was beautiful, polished black wood gleaming under the chandelier. She hadn't touched a piano like that in years. Inside her, a quiet voice whispered that maybe this was her chance. Not to prove something to them, but to remind herself that she still carried music within her. She hesitated, then nodded slightly. The room went quiet as she slowly walked toward the piano. One of the guests laughed again, saying she probably didn't even know how to turn the piano on. Another joked about filming it for fun. Lila didn't react. She pulled the stool back, sat down, and took a deep breath. Her hands hovered above the keys. For a brief second, she was no longer in the grand hall surrounded by people who saw her as just the help. She was back in her childhood home, in the small church where her grandmother had taught her to play. She remembered the rough wooden bench, the smell of old hymn books, and her grandmother's warm voice saying, "Play with your heart, not your hands." When her fingers touched the keys, everything changed. The first note rang through the air, deep and full. The laughter stopped instantly. Her hands moved gently but with certainty, each chord flowing into the next. The room fell silent. The music she played wasn't something anyone had expected. It wasn't a simple tune. It was a piece filled with emotion, sadness, longing, and strength all woven together. Her fingers danced over the piano like they had a life of their own. The melody rose and fell, soft at times and powerful at others. People exchanged glances, realizing this was no joke. Even those who had laughed now stood still, eyes fixed on her. Mrs. Caldwell covered her mouth in disbelief. She had never known that her maid could play like this. She had hired Lila a few months ago and had always found her quiet, polite, and hardworking. But she had never guessed there was this kind of hidden brilliance behind her silence. As Lila played, her memories surfaced in the music. She remembered her grandmother's hands guiding hers, the church full of music every Sunday, and how that piano had once been her escape. But then came the years when life became too heavy. After her grandmother passed away, the music faded from her days. She had to work, had to survive. She had left her small town for the city, taking any job she could find. Playing piano became something she did only in her mind until tonight. By now, a few guests had tears in their eyes. The sound was too honest, too full of life to ignore. The arrogance in the room melted into something softer, almost humble. The man who had made the joke stared at the floor, uncomfortable. When Lila reached the final part of her perform, when Lila woke up the next morning, she had no idea that her life was about to change forever. The night before, she had gone to bed feeling lighter than she had in years. She was proud, not because of the applause or the compliments, but because she had finally played again. For her, that moment was enough. She thought it would end there, a beautiful memory from a strange evening. But the world had other plans. Her phone began buzzing nonstop before sunrise. She usually kept it silent, but the vibration against her nightstand woke her. When she opened her eyes and saw dozens of missed calls and hundreds of notifications, she thought there must have been a mistake. It wasn't until she opened one of the messages from a coworker that she realized something incredible had happened. The video of her playing the piano at the Caldwell mansion had gone viral overnight. At first, she didn't even know what to think. The clip had been posted on social media by one of the guests, and within hours it had spread across different platforms. People were sharing it with captions like "The Maid Who Silenced the Room" and "You Never Know Who Stands Before You." Thousands of comments filled the screen, and nearly all of them were words of admiration and disbelief. People wrote about how moved they were by her performance. Some said the music brought them to tears. Others said it reminded them to never judge anyone by appearance. She scrolled through the comments with her hand over her mouth, overwhelmed. The same people who had ignored her or looked down on her kind of work were now calling her a hidden gem and a gift to the world. By mid-morning, reporters started showing up near the Caldwell house, hoping to get more information. Mrs. Caldwell called her, her voice filled with both excitement and concern. She told Lila that the video had already reached national news. Lila's story had become a symbol, a moment of pure talent and humility that touched hearts everywhere. Mrs. Caldwell told her gently to take a day off and not come in until things calmed down. But things didn't calm down. If anything, they grew bigger. Music producers started asking about her. A local TV show wanted to interview her. A nearby community college reached out, offering to let her join their music program for free. For a while, Lila didn't know what to do. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She was a maid, quiet, hardworking, and used to being in the background. The sudden spotlight felt strange. But then she thought about her grandmother, about how she used to say, "When the world finally hears your song, don't hide it." Those words gave her courage. 2 days later, she agreed to appear on a local morning show. They sent a car to pick her up. When she arrived at the studio, the bright lights and cameras made her nervous, but the host treated her with kindness. They showed the clip of her playing, and as the notes filled the room again, everyone watching grew quiet. Then the host asked her to talk about her life, how she had learned to play, what that night meant to her. Lila spoke softly but confidently. She told them about her grandmother and how music had been their way of communicating love. She said she never imagined anyone would notice her again after all those years away from the piano. Her voice wavered when she said that she had thought her gift was gone forever, but that night had reminded her that it was still alive. After the interview, people from all over began writing letters to her. Some shared stories of their own struggles. Others sent her videos of themselves learning to play piano because she had inspired them. It touched her deeply. She realized her music had become more than just a performance. It had become a reminder to others not to give up on their hidden passions. Meanwhile, Mrs. Caldwell stood by her side like family. She told Lila that the house would always be her safe space no matter what. The Caldwell family became protective of her, turning away reporters who tried to dig into her private life. Mrs. Caldwell's daughter, who had once barely spoken to her, now wanted to learn piano directly from her. One afternoon, when the attention started to calm a bit, Lila returned to the mansion. Mrs. Caldwell greeted her with a warm hug and asked if she'd like to play again, just for the family this time. Lila smiled and agreed. As she sat down at the same piano, memories of that unforgettable night washed over her. She began playing a slow, emotional tune, one she had been working on ever since that night. It was something new, something that came from her heart. The music carried through the halls again, but this time there was no judgment, no laughter, only quiet admiration. Mrs. Caldwell's daughter sat beside her, watching her fingers with wide eyes, and whispered that she wanted to learn to play just like her. Lila smiled and told her gently that music wasn't about being perfect. It was about feeling. That simple moment brought Lila more happiness than all the attention in the world. Weeks went by, and the viral fame began to settle, but the impact remained. She was invited to perform at a community event to raise money for local schools. At first, she hesitated. The idea of performing in front of hundreds of people made her anxious. But when she walked onto the small stage that day, something in her heart told her it was right. The crowd cheered when they introduced her as the Maid whose music touched the world. She took a deep breath, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. The sound was pure, full of emotion and grace. As she played, she looked at the faces in the audience, people smiling, holding hands, swaying gently to the music. It was then she realized that she wasn't just playing anymore. She was healing. Not just herself, but others. After the performance, people came up to her in tears, thanking her. Some told her that her story reminded them to treat others with kindness. Others said it gave them hope. It was overwhelming, but in a beautiful way. That night, as she returned home, she sat quietly in her small apartment. The piano there was old with a few chipped keys, but she didn't mind. She began to play again softly for herself. The sound filled the little room like warmth filling a cold space. She didn't need applause anymore. She didn't need cameras or crowds. What mattered most to her was that she had found her way back to the music, the same music that once brought her and her grandmother together. A few months later, she began giving free piano lessons to children in her neighborhood. Most of them couldn't afford instruments, but she found ways to make it work. Some practiced on keyboards, others on tablet apps. Lila taught them that music wasn't just about talent, it was about heart. She told them stories about her grandmother, about how music kept them going when life was hard. Soon, the children began performing small concerts in the community center. Parents came to watch, clapping proudly for their kids. Lila often sat in the back, smiling quietly. It made her happy to see them shine. Every now and then, people still recognized her on the street. Some thanked her for inspiring them. Others asked if she would ever record her music. She would laugh softly and say maybe one day, but deep down she knew that her real stage was wherever someone needed to feel hope again. The woman who once scrubbed floors and carried trays had reminded the world, and herself, that every person holds something special inside them, no matter where life puts them. And though that night at the mansion had begun as a cruel joke, it became the turning point of her life. The sound of her piano didn't just stun a room full of strangers, it awakened her purpose. Lila continued to live simply, humbly, but her heart was full. Every note she played carried the story of where she came from and how far she had come. Whenever she sat at a piano, she whispered a quiet thank you to her grandmother, knowing she was still watching, proud and smiling. Her music never stopped after that night. It grew, into classrooms, into hearts, into lives that needed a little light. And though the world knew her as the maid who stunned the room, she knew herself as something far greater. A woman who found her voice again through the keys of an old piano. Mance. Her fingers slowed. The last notes echoed gently through the air, fading like a whisper. No one moved. No one even breathed. It was as if time had stopped. Then suddenly the room erupted in applause. People clapped, cheered, and some even stood up. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes were wet. She walked toward Lila, her voice trembling slightly as she said that it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Lila smiled shyly, her eyes glistening too, and quietly thanked her. The guests who had mocked her earlier now looked at her differently. Some tried to speak to her, others simply looked embarrassed. The man who had made the joke approached her and mumbled an apology, though it barely reached his lips. Lila didn't hold any anger. She just nodded politely and stepped away from the piano, still feeling the weight of what had just happened. After the crowd slowly began to talk again, Mrs. Caldwell asked her gently how long she had been playing. Lila told her about her grandmother, about the church piano and how she hadn't played in years. There was quiet admiration in the air. A few guests wanted to know if she had ever studied music formally. When she said she hadn't, they looked amazed. Mrs. Caldwell insisted that she should continue playing, maybe even teach her daughter. But Lila shook her head. She didn't see herself as a teacher or a performer. For her, music wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection, about remembering where she came from and who she was. Still, something in her had shifted. As she stood there hearing people praise her, she realized that she had almost let her gift disappear. Life had pushed her so hard that she had forgotten the one thing that had always made her feel alive. But now she could feel it again, the same warmth her grandmother had once spoken about. That night after the party ended, Mrs. Caldwell asked Lila to sit with her in the quiet dining room. She poured her a cup of tea and thanked her again, not as an employer thanking a worker, but as one woman speaking to another. She told her that her performance had changed something in that room, that it had reminded people that real talent, real grace, can come from anywhere. Lila went home that night feeling light, almost weightless. She walked through the quiet streets with her hands tucked in her coat pockets, the sound of her own music still ringing softly in her mind. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, and for the first time in a long time she smiled for herself. But little did she know, that performance wasn't going to stay a private memory for long. Someone at the party had recorded it. By the next morning, it would begin to spread online, gathering attention from people who had never met her, people who would be moved just like those guests were, and soon her life, once simple, quiet, and unseen, was about to change in ways she never imagined. That night had started with a joke, something meant to embarrass her. But it ended with a standing ovation that came straight from the heart. And for Lila, it became the moment that reminded her that no matter where life takes you, your gift never truly leaves you. It just waits for the right moment to return. Her mother used to play when the sun was setting and the day felt peaceful. As the concert day drew closer, she started to feel nervous. What if she made a mistake? What if the audience didn't like her? But every time she felt fear creeping in, she remembered the laughter from that night long ago, the night they asked her to play as a joke. That moment had changed everything. This time she wouldn't play because someone told her to. She would play because she wanted to. On the day before the concert, the host's wife handed her a small wrapped box. "Open it after your performance," she said with a kind smile. The maid thanked her, touched by the gesture. That evening, she practiced one last time in the quiet living room. The girl sat beside her, listening intently. When she finished, the girl whispered, "You're going to be amazing." The maid smiled softly. "I hope so." She looked around the room, the same room where it all began. The memory of that first night flashed before her. The laughter, the fear, the way her hands trembled before she started playing. But now her hands were steady. She was no longer the same person. She was ready. As she walked home that night, the cool wind brushed against her face. The city lights sparkled in the distance, and she felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. She thought about all that had happened, the humiliation that turned into hope, the strangers who became supporters, the music that had brought her back to life. She smiled to herself. Tomorrow would be the biggest day of her life, and she wasn't afraid anymore. She didn't know that the concert would do more than just showcase her talent. It would open a door that would change her future in ways she never imagined. For a moment, the maid just stood there speechless. She had never imagined such permission would be given. "Thank you, ma'am," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman nodded and left the HOA room. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, she sat down at the piano again. The house was silent, the only light coming from a small lamp nearby. She unfolded the sheet Mr. Turner had given her and placed it on the stand. Her fingers moved slowly at first, finding their way through the melody. The tune was gentle, full of warmth. With each note, she felt more connected to herself. She stayed there for hours, lost in the music, until her eyelids grew heavy. Night after night, she returned to the piano. Sometimes she played songs she remembered from her childhood. Other times, she practiced the new one until it sounded perfect. She didn't do it for anyone else, just for herself. It became her escape, her way of remembering who she really was beneath the uniform and the long hours of work. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, Mr. Turner showed up at the house again. He had been invited by the host's wife, who had been quietly impressed by the maid's dedication. When he saw her at the piano, he smiled. "You've been practicing," he said. She nodded shyly. "Every day, sir." He handed her another sheet of music, this one more complex. "Try this," he said. "You're ready." She looked at it nervously. "It looks hard," he smiled. "So was the first one. But you played it beautifully." For a moment she didn't speak. Then she nodded. "I'll try." That night she stayed up late again, playing until her fingers ached. The new piece was challenging, but it filled her heart with energy she hadn't felt in years. Every wrong note made her more determined to get it right. Little by little, she began to believe that maybe she was meant for something more. One evening, as she finished playing, she didn't notice that someone was standing at the doorway watching her, the host's teenage daughter. The girl had come downstairs quietly and was standing there with wide eyes. When the maid finally stopped and looked up, the girl said softly, "That was amazing." The maid smiled gently. "Thank you." The girl hesitated. "Will you teach me?" For a moment, the maid didn't know how to respond. Then she nodded slowly. "If you want to learn, I'll help you." And just like that, something unexpected began. A quiet connection between two very different worlds, joined by the sound of music. What she didn't know was that her late-night practices, her patience, and her heart were about to open doors she never thought she'd walk through. Guests started murmuring. "Did you hear that?" one said. "She played like a professional," another added. "Who would have thought?" But their words didn't matter to her. For the first time in years, she felt alive. As the night went on, she kept to herself. When the guests left, the host's wife came into the kitchen. Her face was softer than usual, the usual air of superiority gone. She stood there awkwardly before saying, "That was really something." The maid smiled faintly. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. The woman nodded but didn't know what else to say. After a pause, she turned and left. When the maid finished cleaning and walked home later that night, the streets were quiet. The air was cool and the moonlight spilled across the sidewalks. She replayed the moment in her mind, the laughter, the silence, the music. It didn't feel real. Her small apartment was dark when she entered. She set down her bag and sat on the edge of her bed. The sound of her own breathing filled the space. She looked down at her hands and smiled to herself. They were still slightly sore from scrubbing dishes all day, but tonight they had reminded her of something she thought she had lost forever. She didn't have much. A small room, an old lamp, and a single photograph of her mother on the wall. But that night, she had something more powerful than all of it. She had music again. What she didn't know was that her quiet performance had left a deep impression on more than one person at that party. Among the guests had been a man who taught music at a local community center. He hadn't said much that night, but the look on his face had been one of surprise and curiosity. He had heard hundreds of students play over the years, but there was something raw and genuine in her performance that he couldn't forget. While she lay in bed trying to fall asleep, he was already thinking about finding out who she was. The next morning, the maid woke up early and went back to work as usual. The family didn't mention the piano. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. She didn't mind. She wasn't expecting praise or attention. She just wanted to keep her job and stay out of trouble. But deep down, she felt a quiet hope growing inside her. A small part of her wondered if that moment had meant something more than she realized. Days passed and life returned to normal. The same routines, the same faces, the same chores. But sometimes, when no one was around, she would sneak into the living room, lift the piano lid, and let her fingers touch the keys again, just for a few minutes. Each time she played, she remembered her mother's voice, her laughter, and the dream she once had of performing on a real stage. It was a dream she had buried long ago, but now, with every note she played in secret, it began to stir again. And while she didn't know it yet, that quiet melody she had played that night would soon change everything.